Welcome, folks. This is Tim. We'll still give a few more minutes for other folks to have the opportunity to join us. Welcome new attendees. This is Tim. We're going to give it to 3:05, another minute, and then we'll start the presentation. Right. Well, we're get started now. Welcome everyone to the Electrification Reach Code Community Meeting for the City of Culver City. My name is Tim Katsouris, and my role with the Community Development Department and Building Safety is the building official. We're here today to continue the discussion of policy development for the city's first local electrification reach code. This is the third meeting in this round of public outreach regarding the electrification reach code amendments. Now these amendments, there's lots of approaches that the city may take, and potentially some of the approaches might limit or prohibit gas in new construction. Thank you for your time to join us today. An important part of the process is community input and involvement to inform future policies and priorities. The vision for this engagement meeting is to help create prioritized policies and actions related to electrification reach codes for the new buildings. At a high level, the state is focused on hearing your suggestions related to potential policy directions for the upcoming building code cycle. There was a comment already. The building safety presentation for today's link is not working. The content today on these slides is the same as the August 25th and 29th meeting link. So the link will be updated after the presentation. With that, I'll now pass it off to our meeting facilitator today, principal in charge of this project from ID 360, Melanie Jacobson, and the project manager from ID 360, Layla Silver.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everyone. My name is Melanie Jacobson. I'm principal with ID 360, and we also have Layla Silver on the line, who will be diving into some of the details of the policy project. Next slide. Okay, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation, so please hold your questions till then. However, you can use the chat function to submit the questions if you'd like to in real time. And then once we get to the Q&A session, if you could use the hand raising function if you have a question or if you'd like to share feedback in real time, that will help us facilitate the discussion. And then there is, as it was mentioned earlier, the link on the website will be updated, and you can feel free to use your phone or tablet to scan the QR code on this slide to access the presentation materials and other supplemental resources on the city's REACH code website. So moving into the agenda for today's community engagement meeting, we'd like to set the stage for today's meeting by sharing the city's commitment to sustainability initiatives, and we'll also introduce some key priorities that are directly tied to REACH codes and to building electrification. So before we present the electrification REACH code policy and discussion, we will provide a brief background on REACH codes. We'll then dive into the introduction to electrification to lay the foundation of the REACH code policy approaches that we'll be reviewing today. We also like to highlight for you some of the changes that are on the horizon with the 2022 building code cycle update, particularly the California Energy Code that will go into place early next year statewide. And then after this, we'll focus on the statewide REACH code programs initiative with a review of some of the activities happening at the state level right now. And then following that, we'll move into the Q&A discussion portion of the meeting, and then we'll wrap up with the next steps that the city is taking. So the objectives of our engagement meeting today is really to provide you an educational background on energy REACH codes and the pathways that are available. We'll review the energy REACH code adoption process and then respond to your questions and comments regarding the local energy REACH code approaches that we'll be looking at that the city is considering. And lastly, we'll share some next steps that the city will be taking for the REACH code policy. So with this, I'm going to pass it now to Layla Silver, who's going to talk specifically about some of the sustainability initiatives and the REACH code elements that the city is considering at this time.
Great. Thanks, Melanie. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon. So as Melanie mentioned, we just wanted to kind of set the stage with some of the actions that the city has already taken and is planning to take as we move forward in regard to sustainability. So the city really remains a regional leader in its commitment to sustainability. Back in 2007, the city actually signed on to the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. And then in 2017, the city joined the Mayor's National Climate Action Agenda. So all of this also led to, in 2009, the city adopting a green building program to address climate change, really through smart green building practices for new construction projects, as well as new addition and major renovation projects. And phase 1 of the city's REACH code efforts went into effect in 2021. Some of those measures that were addressed as a part of that phase 1 included light pollution reduction, looking at water use, construction waste reduction efforts, shower facilities for bike parking, as well as defensible space in wildland-urban interface areas. Now, furthermore, Culver City has joined the Clean Power Alliance, a community choice aggregation that was formed to deliver energy power generated by renewable sources. And on top of that, the city maintains a platinum level leadership in Southern California Edison's energy leadership partnership mode, which shows that the city has actually reduced energy consumption by over 28% since the year 2006. Now, a big driver of all of these policies that the city has taken is really aimed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to support climate change action. So we're going to kind of kick off this presentation today with some background details on what electrification reach codes are. So globally and domestically, especially here in California, communities are experiencing rapidly changing economics and policies related to climate action and implementation. Now, the reality of climate change impacts here in California have really become more intense year after year. A lot of communities across the state are experiencing more extreme weather conditions, wildfires, coastal erosion, and sea level rise. Now, there have been a lot of recent national and state level policies that have shifted the role of local governments in mitigating the effects of climate change. Now, we don't have time today to dive into all of the climate action related legislation that's going on in California as well as across the United States. But, this ranges really from on a federal level. The call for action for government-wide approach to climate change from President Biden, down to executive orders issued here in the state of California, such as the goal of carbon neutrality by the year 2045, as well as 100% of in-state sales of new passenger cars and trucks to be zero emission by 2035. So it's really safe to say that climate change policy is here to stay. And now, due to the evolving regulatory efforts and climate preservation efforts that are occurring at all these different levels of government, California jurisdictions are adopting what is known as local building electrification reach codes, as well as electric vehicle charging infrastructure reach codes in support of these climate goals. So really, one of the first questions that we have to answer is why reach codes? And there are numerous reasons why California jurisdictions are exploring and adopting these local energy reach codes. On a first kind of basic level, reach codes really support local policy goals that might live in sustainability implementation plans or climate action plans, such as here in Culver City. There are also numerous benefits that are attributed to electrification reach codes, including savings on energy. And depending on the type of reach code, this can also be related to money saved over time, in particular related to operations and utility costs. Reach codes can also contribute towards efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonization efforts through design that considers not only energy efficiency, but the fuel type of that building. And, many cities have climate action plans now that include strategies to really promote increasing energy efficiency, but also promoting increasing access to clean and renewable energy. So we're really seeing these strategies kind of become interconnected through these reach code policies. And, when you have clean energy that's also available for buildings that are more efficient, it really propels decarbonization efforts in a really positive way. And we're really seeing that this is the case when electrification of buildings and transportation is fueled by renewable or carbon-free energy sources such as solar and wind. Now, the second question that's pretty common is, what is a reach code? So reach codes are adopted locally and will vary by jurisdiction as every city or town is unique, but there are some basic fundamentals of reach codes that kind of remain unchanged across the board. So some folks on this call might be familiar with the statewide California Building Code. The statewide code is updated every 3 years. So the 2022 code will actually take effect on January 1st, 2023. Currently, we are in the 2019 code cycle. Now, reach codes can be amendments to various parts of the California Building Code, but the focus for reach codes primarily ends up being on amending the California Energy Code or Title 24 Part 6, or the California Green Building Code, also known as Cal Green, or Title 24 Part 11. Now, all reach codes are voluntary codes that a jurisdiction locally adopts, and it in essence reaches beyond the baseline statewide requirements. So really what this means is that these reach code ordinances that are adopted will require something in addition to the requirements of the state's building code. Now, energy reach codes are also based on local prototypes built within California Energy Commission or CEC approved energy modeling software. The reach codes also go hand in hand with cost effectiveness studies that outline certain modeling assumptions and the results to basically demonstrate the cost effectiveness of a particular reach code for a particular building. And then furthermore, all reach codes cannot preempt federal appliance efficiency standards. Now, the slide that you're seeing here is really just to outline the typical reach code process in terms of development and implementation. So, most policies, when we're talking about reach codes, will originate with staff meetings to discuss priorities, identify goals, as well as the particular approaches to potentially explore. And this really typically will stem from a city's sustainability initiatives or climate action plan. Now, this all kind of goes in parallel with some of the initiatives that are happening at the statewide level, which we'll get into in some upcoming slides. I mentioned the cost effectiveness studies, which are done by the statewide Reach Code program team, all to support the development of these local reach codes. Now, while staff is developing these reach codes, what's also happening in parallel is this local stakeholder input and the public process to solicit feedback from community members like yourself who are on this call today. And all of that goes into the consideration for the city's local energy reach codes. So these public engagement meetings are a really critical component of the development process. Now, ultimately, after the engagement meetings are completed and the reach code is drafted in its ordinance form, that code gets taken to City Council to be reviewed and approved. Once approved, it will actually go through statewide agency level approval process before it is actually ultimately able to be enforced with this target effective date kind of at the end of our timeline. So as I mentioned, the upcoming building code, the 2022 building code, will go into effect on January 1st, 2023. And it's typical for cities to try to align with this code cycle update to make it really predictable for, developers, homeowners, anyone who might be, submitting for a building permit. So this is kind of a snapshot of our typical development to implementation timeline for reach codes. So now that we've kind of touched on what reach codes are, the why of, why it's important, we'd like to also take the next handful of slides to introduce some concepts around building electrification, as this relates to the type of local energy reach codes that are available for cities to adopt. So, one of the first questions, what is building electrification? And it may sound a little complex, but it really is a simple concept. Building electrification really just means using electric appliances and equipment, such as induction cooktops or heat pump water heaters, in our homes and business establishments. Now, basically, electric appliances still perform the same job or service, heating and cooling our homes, providing hot water for our showers, cooking our food. However, they bring about more benefits than gas-fueled appliances or systems. And we'll explore some of those benefits in the next upcoming slides. So building electrification has been found to offer many financial, health, and environmental benefits. On one hand, electric appliances can be better for indoor air quality purposes, which is really critical for human health and safety. There are some studies out there about this, in particular one from the Rocky Mountain Institute that actually found there is higher risks of developing asthma for children who grow up in homes that have gas stoves. And so, switching to electric stoves, such as an induction stove, can help to eliminate some of the invisible pollutants that come from burning natural gas inside a building. Now, electric appliances such as heat pump water heaters and HVAC systems are also more energy efficient than their gas counterparts, which can help to save money in energy costs down the line. And then on top of that, electric appliances can also be powered by carbon-free or renewable energy sources, such as rooftop solar, or when there are clean power options that are available, for example, through the Clean Power Alliance, the local CCA that services Culver City. Now, when we compare this to fossil fuels, the benefits of electrification can really become even clearer. So, in the previous slide, we talked about the benefits to indoor air quality, but on top of that, electrification has been shown to be the lowest cost, lowest risk way to achieve carbon-free sources of energy. And there have been a couple of studies that have shown that, but really, this is where the cost effectiveness studies can come into play. There is a substantial cost savings to avoid gas infrastructure, as well as the maintenance that goes into the gas grid as well. So just on a high level in terms of some of the studies that are happening, this is where a lot of the research is pointing to in terms of electrification kind of being this lowest cost, lowest risk pathway. Now, on top of that, electrification has been kind of pinpointed as an opportunity for job creation. There are a couple of studies, one through UMass and also some UCLA studies that really look at the job losses that would happen as a result of moving to electrification. And there are many jobs to be gained that actually outweigh the losses. There are also some, support kind of planned at the statewide level for displaced oil and gas workers, including well capping training and funding for early retirement. So a lot of this is being considered and being planned at the state level to really support a lot of the electrification reach code activities that are happening at a local level here in the state of California. Now, because the purpose is to electrify, we also just want to take a look and understand where California's current gas usage is. So as you can see from these two graphs here, both residential and non-residential, the most gas usage is predominantly in the water heating and the space heating areas for both residential and non-residential building stocks. Now, on the residential side, this is followed up by cooking, pool heating, and then clothes drying. And on the non-residential side, water heating and space heating is, also followed up by cooking as the highest percentage. And then non-residential building occupancies also have kind of this miscellaneous sector, which is typically associated with process uses of natural gas. Now, the proposed REACH code initiatives that typically look at electrification really focus on electrifying these end uses that we're seeing here. Now, luckily, kind of on a national scale, electric homes are already the majority of new construction homes. So 60% of new construction homes in the United States actually use electric space heating. During the time of this survey, 40% was actually derived from heat pumps specifically, and we'll likely see this trend kind of grow as we move forward throughout our next building code cycles. 55% already use electric water heating, 62% already use electric cooking, and 75% are already using electric clothes drying appliances in new homes. So we wanted to share this slide to really just highlight that, the technology is available, the appliances are available, and the trade knowledge is there. And so we have, a really good basis to kind of continue this trend and build upon this. Now, this slide just really shows and displays some of the appliances and the systems and what they look like for residential and commercial building types. So you'll see here we have on the space heating side of things, this slide is showing what typical residential and commercial heat pumps look like. And a heat pump is basically just a reversible air conditioner. If you think about an AC, it cools the air inside your house and dumps the heat outside. Well, if you add a reversing valve to that refrigerant line, it then cools the outside air and brings the heat inside. So it's, it kind of reverses that mechanism. And heat pump technology is pretty pervasive and cost neutral compared to air conditioning, and this has been found to be true for most residential and commercial applications. Now, also on the water heating side, there are heat pumps that are available for water heating for both residential and commercial applications. On the cooking side, when we're talking about electric cooking, we're not talking about the old coil stoves, we're really talking about induction cooking. And induction itself is a pretty interesting technology. The induction technology basically uses a current in the cookware, whether that's stainless steel or cast iron, and it makes the cookware hot. So if you notice in this picture, over here with the underneath cooking, there's a bar of chocolate in this image, and the bar of chocolate that is on the pan is melted, but the chocolate that is directly on the induction stove is not melted. And this is because of that induction technology. Now, there are also commercial applications for induction cooking. Induction stoves in commercial kitchens or even catering can also be pretty common because they don't contribute a lot of waste heat, and they often require a smaller vent or no vent in terms of infrastructure that is required. And then lastly, we have clothes drying. So there is heat pump technology that is available on the market today for clothes drying. And in regard to larger industrial clothes dryers, the heat pump technology isn't quite there yet. Right now, they are primarily electric resistance technology. However, we're really seeing the industry making moves in regard to heat pump technology for these various applications. So lastly, we also wanted to kind of bring this conversation around equipment efficiency, since this is another thing to keep in mind when comparing electric appliances to natural gas appliances. Now, the efficiency of our gas appliances on average is around 80%. If you have an existing storage tank water heater in your home, it might be closer to 60% in terms of efficiency, while the newer condensing hot water heaters can get around 90 to 95% efficiency. Now, when we compare this to a heat pump, we actually see a really huge jump in efficiency for heat pumps, around 350%. And this is primarily because heat pumps move heat to one place to another. It doesn't combust to generate heat. And so because it's moving heat almost like a refrigerator does, this actually makes up a big portion of the cost disparity that we see between relatively lower gas rates and relatively higher electric rates. Now, when we're looking at resistance and induction cooking, the max efficiency is about 1 for cooking, as well as high intensity industrial processes. So now that we've laid the foundation of what a reach code is, what building electrification is, we now would like to present an overview of the electrification reach codes. So some of the folks here on this call today may be aware that there are numerous jurisdictions here in California that have already adopted or are exploring the potential to adopt an electrification reach code. You know, under the 2019 code cycle, over 50 California jurisdictions actually adopted some type of local building electrification reach code. And, you know, at this time, there's over, 50 jurisdictions that are also considering reach codes for the upcoming code cycle. Now, there are a variety of policy approaches to these reach codes, and we'll get more into the specifics of the approaches for the 2022 code cycle, but generally they will fall into certain categories, typically all electric whole building reach codes, all electric reach codes that look at specific systems, or electric preferred reach codes, which allow for mixed fuel options, but also apply some enhanced energy efficiency requirements for those mixed fuel options compared to no enhanced efficiency requirements for an all electric building. And then of course, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There are many jurisdictions that have their own EV infrastructure reach codes. Now, this slide is just to kind of highlight some of the neighbors in the, around Culver City that have committed to a reach code policy. So, this slide is just highlighting a handful of those. For example, Santa Monica, under the 2019 code cycle, the city adopted an electric preferred ordinance that had pathways for all electric new construction or mixed fuel buildings. But again, those mixed fuel buildings were required to perform higher than the baseline state energy code standards. And actually for the upcoming code cycle, Santa Monica is looking at adopting a zero emissions building code that prohibits the installation of fuel gas infrastructure in new buildings with certain alterations or additions in the event that a demolition will occur. Now, West Hollywood also has reach codes that are specific to solar PV requirements as well as cool roofs. And Ojai does have an all-electric design requirement for new construction, both residential and commercial buildings. The County of Los Angeles does have a cool roof reach code requirement. And just also on another level, the City of Los Angeles most recently, their council voted back in May of this year to prohibit most gas appliances in new construction. So effectively having an all electric type of reach code. So before we dive into the Reach Code initiative activities happening at the state level and the pathways that are available for the city to adopt, we've put together a slide to highlight some of the changes that are happening in the 2022 California Energy Code that is coming down the line on January 1st of next year. So as I mentioned, currently we're in the 2019 code cycle and we're looking ahead to the 2022 code cycle. Now, there are a handful of ways that the 2022 code differs from the current code cycle that we are in particular when it comes to new construction. So the California Energy Commission has actually made heat pumps the prescriptive baseline and establishes a project's energy budget based on heat pumps for space or water heating. And this is really in an effort to encourage builders to install heat pumps over gas-fueled HVAC units. So what this really means is that for both new residential and non-residential buildings, heat pump technology sets the project's energy budget for space heating or water heating in certain climate zones within the energy model. Now, because of this also, there's a performance credit in the energy model for all electric design buildings. So it effectively makes the state's energy code electric preferred because of this performance credit. Now, just narrowing in on the residential side of things, another requirement that is going to be new for next year is pre-wiring will now be required for any installed gas appliances. So this means that the code will require homes to be electric ready with a dedicated 240-volt outlet and space with plumbing for water heaters so that electric appliances can eventually replace installed gas appliances. And this is really to facilitate the future installation of electric appliances to replace gas counterparts. Now, also on the residential side of things, there are going to be higher ventilation rates for gas stoves when they are installed. So it effectively increases the minimum kitchen ventilation requirements over cooktops so that there's higher airflow to capture efficiency, to better exhaust pollution from gas cooking. And again, this goes back to improving indoor air quality in our buildings and homes. Now, energy storage readiness is also going to be required. This is a big new kind of addition for residential. This will include the new building or new home to have panel capacity, as well as physical space for this energy storage readiness actually shown on the plans for that particular new home. Now, on the non-residential side of things, one of the biggest changes is that solar PV is now going to be required to be installed. Previously, this was a solar ready requirement, so now the actual technology will need to be installed for that building. And on top of that, there are battery storage prescriptive requirements for certain building types. So this will range from like new office buildings, new hotels and motels, new retail and grocery stores. They'll all need to have systems that are basically sized to maximize the on-site use of solar energy and avoid electricity demand during times when the grid must use gas-powered plants. So this is really, all aimed at encouraging and requiring, renewable sources of energy, also increasing resiliency in our buildings. Now we're going to look at the 2022 statewide REACH Code initiative. And I mentioned earlier, it's the statewide REACH Code program that provides the cost effectiveness studies, as well as some of the supporting model REACH Code language and resources for all jurisdictions here in California. So just starting off with some timeline updates related to the statewide efforts, in particular, the cost effectiveness research efforts, in case anyone here is really interested in taking a look at those. So right now, what the state has published are preliminary cost effectiveness results for new single family, new multifamily, and new commercial buildings. The final results were anticipated to be available at the end of this month. So we are, keeping a really close eye on any updates from the statewide team for the final updated versions of these cost effectiveness studies. And on another level, the state is also providing some specific studies that look at electric pool heating and spa heating. This was a really big kind of item that came out of some of the 2019 REACH Code efforts that were happening, as well as a specific study on accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. Now, we just wanted to kind of highlight some items related to the cost effectiveness studies. We're not going to get into the weeds or the details of these studies, since it is a very robust topic, but just to provide a kind of brief overview. Now, the cost effectiveness analyses are required for local amendments to the California Energy Code. And there are two metrics or methodologies that the study uses to demonstrate cost effectiveness. The first is called on-bill, which is the customer-based life cycle cost approach that values energy based upon the estimated site energy usage, as well as the customer on-bill savings. So it really is focused on the individual consumer and the utility rates that are impacted by that. Now, the second methodology is called time-dependent valuation, or TDV. And this particular metric is actually connected to the California Energy Commission itself. This is what is used in the California Energy Code to evaluate cost effectiveness of efficiency measures. And it's really intended to capture the societal value or cost of energy use. So it differs from on-bill in that it values energy differently, but also kind of takes that societal approach looking at carbon emissions as well. Now, it's up to the jurisdiction to make that final determination on which metric will be used to justify cost effectiveness. The CEC does not make this determination. It is based on a local decision. And again, as I mentioned earlier, cost effectiveness, a part of it is that these REACH codes cannot preempt federal appliance standards and require something more stringent than federal appliance standards. Now, all of the kind of REACH code cost effectiveness efforts are based upon certain efficiency measures that are then assembled into packages, such as an all-electric package or an all-electric package with mixed fuel commercial kitchen. And it's those packages that have to be found to be cost effective when taken together. So the cost effectiveness studies and the initiatives that are happening at the state level with REACH codes basically support the REACH code approaches or pathways for jurisdictions to adopt. And we're going to take a look at those in a couple of slides. But first, we wanted to preface the possible REACH code pathways with the main trigger point and some of the building types that can be considered to be impacted by the local REACH code. So the main trigger that we are talking about here today is for new construction. So this means that existing buildings, including addition or alteration construction projects, would not be subject to any local electrification REACH code requirement. Now, the building types that can be impacted by the REACH codes can vary, and the cost effectiveness studies also support the building types that you're seeing on this slide. So ranging from new residential single family homes and accessory dwelling units, new detached ADUs, new multifamily buildings, and new non-residential buildings, including hotels, offices, retails, and restaurants. Now, there are certain exemptions just on a statewide level for certain building types, in particular H or I occupancy types. And this is really buildings like hospitals or institutional buildings in that nature. And then, of course, existing buildings. So we're talking about here new construction. So the table on this slide will really be a big part of the discussion today. So again, I just want to stress that the REACH code policies that we are talking about are aimed at new construction only and will not impact existing buildings. So the table that you're seeing here breaks down the pathways or approaches that are supported by the statewide initiative, and these are the approaches that the city can consider for adoption for the REACH codes. So I'm going to go over each of these options and then talk about the approaches here that we're seeing, some of the considerations, and kind of go over the requirements of each of these. So I'm going to start on the left-hand side and make my way over to the right-hand side of the table. So the first pathway is the efficiency pathway. This pathway would require that all new construction exceed the minimum energy code requirements. And this would go for both all electric buildings as well as buildings that are mixed fuel or have natural gas end uses in them. Now, there are some considerations around this particular pathway in that, on the first level, it does preserve choice. It gives the builder, the developer, the homeowner the option to choose all electric or mixed fuel. However, it does require enhanced efficiency above the statewide level requirements. So it does still reach beyond the California Energy Code minimum standards. Now, it does also allow for some specific measures, and it can be pretty simple in terms of the options that are available. Now, the second option here on this table is electric preferred. So this approach would basically require only mixed fuel buildings to exceed the minimum California Energy Code requirements. And this is typically looked at by achieving a compliance margin above the statewide standards within the energy model itself. So the kind of consideration around this is that it still does preserve choice. However, it also incentivizes going all electric because in the electric preferred scenario, all electric buildings would not be required to have any enhanced efficiency. They would just need to meet the minimum state code requirements. But of course, they would be all electric. This pathway also, when we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions and our climate action plan initiatives, does have the lowest amount of greenhouse gas savings associated with it. Now, the third approach here is the electric only approach. And I'm sure you've noticed that there are kind of two different electric only pathways. So I'm going to go over the first one, the third column here on this table first. So the first electric only pathway is done by amending the California Green Building Standards Code, or Cal Green. And this pathway simply allows only for electric appliances for specific end uses with certain exemptions. So this particular REACH code pathway does allow the city to include certain exemptions, for example, for commercial kitchens. This particular pathway is not considered a REACH code efficiency measure because it really just establishes the requirement for the fuel type itself. Now, right next to it, we have another electric only pathway, but this is done in a completely different way. So the alternative would be the Natural Gas Moratorium, also known just kind of casually as like the gas ban. This particular approach actually does not amend the building code. So we're not amending the energy code or Cal Green. It's actually done through a jurisdictional authority through amending the health and safety code. And it would basically just establish that there are no new gas infrastructure hookups or piping. Certain exemptions can be made under this type of avenue as well. It is seen as the longest lasting because, as we talked about previously, our building codes renew on a 3-year basis. So every 3 years for any amendment to the energy code or the green building code, the city would have to renew that, whereas the natural gas moratorium, because of its amendment to the health and safety code, it actually has a longer lasting impact and is not subject to that 3-year renewal cycle. And over the last 2 years, there's been, a handful of jurisdictions who have adopted some kind of form of this particular ordinance approach. Now, the last option on this table is called the electric only plus efficiency pathway. And it's basically a combination REACH code. It piggybacks off of the electric only requirements, and then it requires that electric building to exceed the minimum California Energy Code standards, whether that's done with a larger lift with PV on the building or through specific prescriptive design efficiency items. So this pathway does need to be renewed every 3 years, and it does modify the California Energy Code, but it allows for enhanced efficiency and kind of load management opportunities in the design of the building. So these pathways here are the pathways that are available for the city to consider when adopting a local electrification reach code. So in addition to getting your feedback today on the reach code pathways that are available, we'd also like to hear about any exemptions to a potential all-electric reach code that the community might be interested in. This slide is showing some of the possible residential exceptions that are available for these electric-only type of reach codes. Namely, there are some exemptions around emergency backup power. When we're thinking about public safety power shutoffs and power outages, this is definitely something that can be considered. There's also specific exemptions in the model code around multifamily residential building projects that may have already received an approved planning entitlement before the effective date of the REACH code, actually allowing those type of projects to use fuel gas for the water heating systems specifically. And, over the past, under 2019 code cycle, REACH codes, there have been exemptions for new swimming pools and spas, indoor and outdoor fireplaces, also water heating or space heating in accessory dwelling units that, share that utility with the existing home. Outdoor barbecues has also come up. And typically with these exemptions, a common requirement would be electric readiness, so that in the event that there is an end use that is exempt, that electric readiness would have to also be included, which also stays aligned with the California Energy Code's electric readiness requirement that we touched on earlier in this presentation. Now, it's also typical for REACH codes to include some sort of infeasibility guidelines that capture waivers for cost burdens or other technical infeasibilities. On the non-residential side of things, you might notice that a lot of the exemptions remain the same. However, there are a couple of different ones that I'll highlight. So one is for commercial kitchens. It is a pretty common exemption for electric reach codes to exempt commercial kitchens. And then also for hotels and motels that have over a certain amount of guest rooms, could utilize fuel gas in on-site commercial clothes drying equipment. And again, these modifications, if something is granted, then electric readiness would be required, and all of the typical infeasibility exemptions that we touched on in the previous slide would also extend to new non-residential buildings as well. So before we open the floor to discussion, we just wanted to kind of highlight some of the considerations and highlight some kind of permit data to help inform some of the kind of strategies on considerations that we're looking at today. So as a part of the REACH code policy development effort, the city did take a look at some recent permit data. The city, as of right now, issues approximately 35 new single-family residential building permits every year. And also on this slide is kind of a summary of some of the entitlement data for major projects that are in the pipeline. So this includes one 150 room hotel, one new office building, one 4-unit condominium, and also one new mixed-use building that has 82 residential units as well as retail on the first floor. So this is really just to kind of show typically what the city is already issuing permits for in terms of quantity, and really taking a look at some of the future projects that might be coming down the line that may be impacted by a local energy reach code. So these next two slides that we're going to go through just really outline some of the REACH code policy considerations that go into this development process. It might be helpful to prompt some of the feedback that we're hoping to gain from you today. So on one hand is going back to those approaches. So that table that we took a look at that outlined the different approaches that are available for the REACH code. And then of course, applicable systems. So looking at the whole building, or if there are considerations for specific types of end uses that you might have comments on. And then of course, the types of buildings that are going to be impacted, this will range from new residential single-family homes, including ADUs, down to multifamily, as well as non-residential types of buildings. And then also these exemptions. So we're really interested to hear any feedback that you might have on specific exemptions for these different types of buildings, whether that's for commercial kitchens, for laboratory spaces, or swimming pools as well. Now, before we open up the floor, I'm just going to take the next couple of minutes to outline some common questions that have come up in previous meetings. As this community meeting is one of many engagement meetings that the city has hosted on the topic of electrification REACH codes. So we'll just go ahead and highlight some of these before we open up the floor. So really common question, will my existing building be affected? No, the city is considering REACH codes for new construction only at this time. Another common kind of point was electricity costs more per unit of energy than natural gas, so electrification may result in higher utility bills. Already with the 2019 code, all new residential homes have been required to have on-site solar PV. And starting, January 1st, 2023, this will be the same case for new non-residential buildings that will have to have solar PV installed, which really help to result in either a net zero electrical bill or a very small electrical bill to cover any of that excess consumption. Now, another question is, how would I cook my meals in a 100% electrified building during a power outage? It is, acknowledged that electric appliances would likely be compromised unless the building was equipped with solar PV and a battery backup system or an electrical generator. But because all new residential buildings are going to be required to have solar PV, and then non-residential buildings will have PV and battery, this will really help to alleviate some of those pain points around this. Furthermore, another consideration is that most, existing homes that have gas stoves right now, they also have an electric ignition. So that part of the stove would still not operate. And then on top of that, the vent system for the stove would also not work, which could impact the indoor air quality if that stove was still being used when the electricity is out. Now, another kind of common comment was that electricity is not a clean power source, and that offsite power generation does produce pollution. But Culver City is supplied by a high proportion of renewable electrical energy. As I mentioned earlier, the city participates in a local CCA that delivers a percentage of power generated by renewable sources. And SCE has also made moves to really kind of diversify the renewable and carbon-free sources that are, being distributed through the grid. And the state is already moving towards clean power for all new construction. As we talked about, PV is already required for residential buildings that are new, and all new commercial buildings starting on January 1st of next year will also be required to have solar PV as well as battery as a requirement. And lastly, common questions around the target building categories that are most prevalent in the city. And we took a look at that building permit data, and, low-rise residential buildings account for most of the existing and new buildings here in the city. And then lastly, will reach codes increase the cost of utilities? And this is where those cost effectiveness analyses come in, which demonstrate that if there are any increased costs associated with implementation, those associated savings and energy costs would eventually result in cost recovery during the reasonable life expectancy of that building. So that cost effectiveness really does become an important part when we're talking about electrification reach codes. All right, so now that I've concluded the presentation, I know there was a lot of information just presented out there, but we would really like to open up the floor. I think some folks were putting in questions in the chat, but if you would like to, have yourself unmuted to share your question or your comment, please raise your hand and we'll go ahead and make it happen.
Okay, I have Jack Walter. I'll unmute you now. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, that's all there. You hear me all right?
Yes.
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Jack.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, again, I'll check. Can I hear you? Can I say something?
Hi, Jack. We can hear you.
There you go, great. That was quite a bit of information, and all good stuff. Going to be a challenge for the construction industry to keep up with it all, and the changes. I know you're not writing the codes or the building codes or the standards that are in each individual city. I'm not sure when to comment because I am a small developer. And we're going to need some sort of guidance on this early on, because when you're planning a building, you need to plan and start architectural 2-3 years, at least 2 years ahead, when you do budgets, and the type of appliances you're going to put in, the way you're going to be doing your cooling and heating, all get engineered early on in the project. And it would be not cost effective to have to go back and re-engineer a project for its electricity or natural gas use or renewable solar heating or renewable energy sources. So the earlier and sooner that this information gets to the municipalities, the better, and make it understandable. And of course, it needs to get to all the engineers as quickly as possible. I would ask that somewhere in all these these ways of regulating what's coming on in the future, that there is a reasonable amount of flexibility for new construction when these systems don't necessarily fit or work. A couple examples would be high-rise office buildings that have very small footprints, and therefore you don't have rooms for PVs, unlike maybe an apartment building that has a large roof area, depending on the amount of floors, which is usually 5 when it's done in wood. But some of the high-rise buildings don't have a big footprint because they go tall, and some exceptions. The technology for getting renewable energy in the windows is in the works, but it's not there yet. So I'm all for it, but I don't think the technology has quite caught up with our dreams of the type of energy and non-pollutant systems that you're talking about. But it's good that it gets pushed along. It's good that we're being talked about, but there's going to be some flexibility. Otherwise, it will tie the hands of developers or make it hard for them to get it financed or budgeted, all the above. So the sooner it's out there and involve some of the larger developers, I would recommend you get some of the smart people in the room that know about this, particularly engineers, and so rubber can hit the road and this stuff isn't just in a presentation, but it actually gets into the construction. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you. Next we have Marcy.
Oh, can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes.
Hi. Yes. So I have a few questions and then a few comments. First off, I'm a bit confused about when you're talking about pools and spas being on gas, because from what my years of being around pools and spas is that we've always used electricity, which has made it very not very cost effective to heat a pool or even a spa. So it's been run on electricity. So my other question that I have is, while we talk about all of these renewable, all of this renewable energy, we aren't discussing the long term, at least with solar panels. They're made with very toxic materials. And currently, even though they've been around for plus 30 years, we don't have any way to recycle them. And so a lot of them have an end game of about 20, 25 years. So what are we going to do as far as recycling? Are we going to push that off to the future generations to figure out how to clean up the toxic mess that we created by these solar panels? And then I was also curious about, you did address some of it, saying that we're going to require everybody having solar panels. And again, these batteries are incredibly toxic that are put on the that are going to be required to be put on some of the buildings, depending on their size and whatnot, so that the backup. But there is this issue of currently our power grid can't even handle the amount of electricity that we already have in the usage. I mean, just coming this next week, as we get the heat is rising right now, where it's getting hotter. So what are we going to do when we overpower our current power grid? And why aren't we looking at some other possibilities of electric power, or even gas, which the natural gas, compared to all of the other gases, is the cleanest burning of them all. So I'm just, are we going to have any recycling programs set up for these solar panels? Is that even in the works? And because there is cadmium, there's lead, there's mercury, there's, and depending on the EV vehicles, there's lithium batteries. So what are we going to do with all of this? Are we just going to pass it off? That's my question. What are we going to do with all of it?
Okay, great. I can take that one, Tim. And I would also ask Lisa if you wouldn't mind promoting Joshua Torres from SCE to take the last question on the grid question. That would be lovely. So these are very valid questions, and thank you, Marcy, for your thoughtful comments. So in terms of your question on the pools and spas, so that one, there's a lot of industry changing and industry realities that are changing around pools and spas and electrification. Just over the last few years, the technology has really advanced in terms of how electricity is deployed for pools and spas. So much so that we're days away from receiving a statewide study on the cost effectiveness specifically of swimming pools and spas, and how the industry is evolving, the kind of workforce implications of that item. So you're really spot on in your comment. So that is forthcoming, and that is why one of the items that is kind of considered for exemption, just because of all of the dynamics of all those different components working together. It's not just the technology, it's also the workforce implications. So very good point to be made. So that will be part of the policy analysis, and part of the discussion that's brought to council for a study session. So that will be part of it. So thank you for that comment, and I hope that addresses your question as well. In terms of the material kind of end of use question related to solar panels and battery backup, yes, there is a number, and just as a kind of point of information. So the state, all of the requirements related to solar panels and battery backup are actually statewide requirements that are going to be effective statewide. So those will work in tandem with proposed local reach codes, but they're not being actually proposed at the local level. So the items that are being proposed at the local level are really just around the building efficiency and or electrification of the appliances. So the PV and the battery components are all statewide code items. And then so in terms of the end of useful life for solar panels and batteries, there are a number of kind of concurrent state legislative efforts to kind of revamp that entire industry. So what came down from the executive order from Governor Newsom was all these mandates to look at these issues and figure out a way to transition the entire industry towards electrification, and in tandem address some of these barriers. I mean, there's no doubt that these are barriers for the industry that the industry needs to address. And so there are a number of statewide efforts that are happening with different agencies that are outside the Building Standards Commission and more on kind of end of use of appliance standards. So those state legislative efforts are definitely in the works. So that's a great comment as well. And then in terms of the grid, I'll ask Mr. Torres to please address that question. Thanks, Josh, for being on the call.
Yeah, my pleasure. So for everybody else on the call, my name is Joshua Torres. I'm a senior policy advisor with Southern California Edison. I also just wanted to kind of add on to your comments too about these waste disposal issues. These are things that the state is looking at. There's been a number of bills in the legislature looking at tackling these recycling issues. And lithium-ion batteries are recyclable. There's actually a state law right now that requires that all electric vehicle batteries be recycled. And it's basically the same technology, whether it's on a Tesla Powerwall in your garage or in your car. Lithium-ion is the same tech. And also too, that these waste disposal issues are very manageable compared to the impact of climate change, right? Sticking with fossil fuels is having, an impact on a global scale. So hence why, we're trying to transition off of those resources. I did drop a link to a fact sheet in the chat for those of you that are interested. So, we have been putting a lot of thought for quite a while into how we manage this transition to a clean energy future in terms of, how do we maintain reliability as we're, transitioning to renewable sources that we don't necessarily have control over, right? We can't control when the sun shines or when the wind blows. How do we accommodate all of these increased electric technologies like electric vehicles, How do we adapt to the effects of climate change with sea level rise, more intense heat waves, drought impacts on our hydroelectric facilities? So we are looking at all of these different things and incorporating those into our forward planning for both the distribution and transmission systems. And we are incredibly confident that, working with the state, working with local governments, if we're all able to work together and build all of these infrastructure improvements, that we will be more than prepared to meet the needs of a clean energy future. Specific to electric buildings are not a concern for us even today. When we look at the demands placed on the grid by an all-electric building versus a building with natural gas, they're pretty similar. When we design the grid, we are designing based on peak consumption. So think of it sort of like rush hour, right? So if a developer, if somebody came up with some crazy idea and they're like, we're going to add 1,000 cars onto the 405 freeway, right? Initially, everybody would be like, wow, that's a terrible idea. But if they said, but they're only going to be on the freeway between midnight and 5 a.m., everybody's asleep, right? There's plenty of capacity, in those off hours. And that's kind of the best analogy for all electric buildings. When we look at the devices that used to be gas that are now electric and when they're consuming electricity, it's what we call off-peak. It's times of the day when there is abundant capacity on the electric grid. And this is why we're not concerned about all electric buildings versus mixed fuel buildings. We are concerned about new construction, regardless of whether it's all electric or whether it's mixed fuel. Any type of new construction, even if it has natural gas, we do want those developers to work with us as early as possible to make sure that we have sufficient capacity on the circuit located near their project. But again, it doesn't matter if it's all electric or new construction. New construction or all electric or mixed fuel. New construction is new construction, and it's just very important for those developers to work with us as early as possible in the process.
I have Paul Ehrlich. One moment, and I'll unmute you. You may go ahead.
Letters to as requested, not letters, emails, but I'd like to just go over just a few items directly, and that has to do with some of the nitty gritty of the issues that were talked about. Just for your information. The city has a public pool called the Plunge. And do you know how it's heated? I know the answer, but I was just wondering if you guys knew the answer, how it's heated. But I'll tell you the answer just for your information. It's heated directly by the sun. In other words, they have not electric solar panels, but they recycle the water in the pool. It goes to panels, and the sun heats the panels, and it heats the swimming pool. And I was wondering if that can be incorporated in private pools around the city. My other question is, some people want to put solar panels on, which is fine, but they want to extend the solar panels beyond the footprint of let's say, a single family residence. And the city right now, I don't believe, has any setback rules for solar panels. In other words, you could, let's say a person, I have a single family home, and I want to put a solar panel on the roof, and I want to have more power. Right now, there's nothing stopping me from extending the solar panels beyond my into the set. Right now, I have a 5-foot setback to the property line, but there's nothing that would stop me from putting solar panels in that space. And I was wondering if the code can address that. There's something called a rapid shutdown device for solar panels, and right now it's a part of the current code, but the older solar panels don't have that. My question is, let's say a person wants to put in a solar panel, and of course it would be required to have the rapid shutdown device for the safety of the firemen, but they could also have solar panels that are not that don't have these devices. And my question is, how would the firemen know that there's two different kinds of panels, one of which could electrocute the firemen? My question, just in general, for a person has a single family residence and they have an ADU, how far are we going to require panels? For example, many people have 100 or less amps on their main building, but on a brand new ADU, would they require a 220 circuitry for charging? Would they require 220 for an oven? Would they require 220 for other appliances? And in other words, is it possible to have a 100 amp panel just on the ADU, and like it could be a 200 amp possibly. In other words, a bigger electrical unit for the ADU than the original building that was put up in let's say in the 1950s. Is if you have just a single ADU, is it going to be a requirement that they have a charging station with that? What about a junior ADU? Are they going to bring a junior, which is a much smaller unit than a regular ADU? Are they going to be required to have a electric charging station? I can't. I don't know what the answer is. When a person, let's say a person wants to put up a home, there aren't that many brand new homes, but they exist. Are they going to require to have pathways between solar panels for two purposes? One is for fireman access, and my second one is if you have a 2-story addition on a building, and one of the escape is through a window onto the roof, you wouldn't want to have a electrical panel right at that particular point. So the exiting requirements would be quite must be laid out and made very clear. I think the code should reflect that. Another point is if you have the weight of the solar panels on the roof, you have to think of and pathways. You also have to think of the weight bearing on the especially old homes. Is it going to? Do we have a weight issue? In other words, if a fireman is on a pathway on a roof, can, can he run into trouble with the roof collapse simply by his own weight? You have his weight. Normally, that's not a problem with an ordinary person, but then you have the weight of the solar panels. Another issue is, can you have a solar panels all the way to the ridge line of a sloping roof? Most codes say no, but I think that that's something that Culver City should address. Here's my biggest concern is that on January 1st, which is actually coming up fairly quickly, you're going to have a major problem. Today, if you have let's say I'll just make a single story building, and you either you're going to remodel to meet code, or you're getting something brand new. The normal thing would be to have a 200 amp electric panel, and right now, today, as we speak, we have about a 6-month delay because electrical panels are extremely hard to come by. My concern is that on January 1st, construction, people won't be able to get a occupancy permit simply because they don't have the 200 amp panel simply doesn't exist. My question is, will it be allowed to have an old-fashioned temporary construction type panel, just so that there can be an occupancy permit? I would not like to have buildings that, I mean, right now we have an issue of homelessness, et cetera, but usually when people think of delays, they're thinking of costs. I'm thinking of delays January 1st because of you can't get the 200 amp panels, and I think that either some kind of moratorium or the use of temporary electric panels should be incorporated in the code. So anyway, there's another thing, there's such a thing as smart electric panels. Smart electric panels are controlled by the internet, and when certain areas of a building can be automatically shut off during the peak times and other times, I was wondering if 100 amp panels, I'm not talking about ordinary panels, I'm talking about smart panels. I wonder if they could be legalized and encouraged in Culver City. That could save quite a bit of money. Well, yeah. Anyway, those are just some of the highlights of my concerns, and I'm just going to bring that back to the panel for discussion.
Great. Thank you, Paul. So there was a number of items in that comment. So I'll address the ones that are related to the code, and then some of the we can discuss as a group on some of the any sort of zoning impacts that may impact these. So in terms of the solar panels, your question about extending beyond the footprint of the building. So currently the the building code, the California Energy Code, regulates PV panels in a very particular way, and there's energy modeling protocols that will dictate where the panels go, at what angle, based on where that building is. There's climate zone information. So there's 16 different climate zones within the state. And then so specialized weather data is loaded into that software. And so the energy model will dictate where the panels can go and will go for the kind of maximum efficiency. So, it's in terms of the PV, the regulations on PV, it really just looks at the building itself. I'm not aware of any setback rules, any local setback rules on solar. Typically it's just regulated for the building. In some cases there'll be like covered parking areas that are regulated in a particular way that may impact the zoning code. But in terms of single family residential or building, any sort of commercial building regulation, it's typically governed by the building code. So those are on the building or in a covered parking scenario. And then in terms of your question related to the rapid setback device for solar, so so the evolution of disconnects that are required for all of this new electrical technology has really engaged the fire marshal community in a new way. And so the industry is definitely engaging with the fire marshal community to make sure that this transition is safe, that the right regulations are included for disconnect purposes to make sure that in the event of an incident that the disconnect is clear, it can be seen from the street. So that community is that conversation is being had at a state level and at a local level. So so definitely that conversation is happening and regulated really at the state level. That's definitely in transition as well. Your question regarding the single family ADU. So in some cases, so from a state level, in some cases, ADUs will require PV, and this will be a statewide requirement, not necessarily a local. The local jurisdiction wouldn't necessarily get an opportunity to amend that unless they wanted to go beyond, and that's not what is being considered in this scenario. But there are a number of exceptions related to context. Junior ADUs in most cases are exempt. But in terms of, the ADU conversation is a very complex conversation for a number of different reasons. And so that's why it's one of the items, we've received your comment regarding your concerns about ADUs. So that's definitely one of the items for discussion with the council and with the community as well. And then in terms of your question regarding the weight of solar on older homes, when in coming in for a building permit, depending on the type of panel, the permitting may trigger a structural review depending on how old the building is, what the building is used for. So yes, that will typically that's like a life safety issue. So that is typically triggered as part of like a new solar application. And the solar industry has really done, kind of made significant efforts to help streamline that, and the state has done so as well. So, that there's definitely action being taken in that area. Then, in terms of your question regarding the panel availability, I might ask Josh to speak to the smart electric panel comment. If you have any comments in discussion with that, that would be most helpful. And
Could you rephrase the question?
oh, yes.
Should I pipe in, right? My question,
Yes,
from my point of view, or would that be best?
yes, please.
Yeah. Normally, if you just look at the code and you add all the 220 lines that are required, in other words, one for air conditioning, one for your oven, and one for the electric automobile, you're blowing the lid off of a normally 100 amp panel. But one of the latest technologies is to allow a 100 amp panel, but it's what they call a smart panel, and the panel is in other words, it can be controlled manually through the internet, or it can be done automatically, which would shut down different parts of the house, and you could keep the 100 amp panel. My question is, has my comment or this new technology and the code requirements that are coming up, do they match, or is this technology ahead of the code? Or are you? Well, let me put it this way: Are you familiar with smart electric panels? That's a relatively new technology.
Yeah, we're very familiar with them at Edison, and we're big fans of them. The code, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the code specifies a panel size. So if your preference is to install a smart panel versus a 200 amp panel, knock yourself out, right? I think the smart panels have more applications in cases of retrofits, right? If you have an existing home that you are retrofitting to add solar or EV charging or make all electric or all of the above, a smart panel might be a less expensive way to accommodate all of those devices. But typically what we're seeing with the builders that we're talking to, when they're doing new construction, they're typically just installing a 200 amp panel for residential.
Okay, well, yeah, and then my other major concern is what's going to happen in January 1st. Are there enough 200 amp panels that won't do some major harm to the installation of construction? In other words, will it delay construction by 6 months, and people won't be able to get an occupancy permit?
Those are supply chain issues, right? I think we're all feeling the same supply chain issues at Southern California Edison. We're feeling supply chain issues for a number of products that we need. You know, I was talking to a restaurateur the other day that said he has a hard time getting salt.
Well, I understand that, but I'm just saying, I'm just focusing on one thing, which is the electric panels, and my second focus is January 1st, when suddenly there's a right now there's a shortage, but on January 1st, it's just going to blow the lid off the thing, and occupancy permits will come to a screeching halt in California. That's my concern.
Hi, Paul. A quick address on that. This is Tim. So when a project gets submitted for review, the code that it is submitted, when it's submitted, that's the one that is under. So projects need to be in the pipeline usually for a bit before, for plan review, and then we issue the permit, and then we get to the construction portion of it. So I think there's some projects would be further down the line when it actually is they are affected. And then if we look, I think Melanie had this group had brought up a few statistics for the Culver City regarding new single-family houses, and I think it was 30 to 35 annually. So I think we'd be talking about a small amount of 200 amp panels.
I know that, but then I just brought that as an example, but I'm talking about duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes, which is the attitude of the city council is to not have single family homes nearly as much as these multiple family units. And what I'm saying is sometime, not January 1st, but starting January 1st, sometime within the year, because of the supply issue, it's going to delay and ultimately cause the housing shortage to be significantly worse. That's my concern. And I was wondering, therefore, is these temporary panels that's used in construction, would they be allowed to be used just to get an occupancy permit? And I was wondering if that would that be a consideration under the code?
A temporary power panel. I think we would need, permanent, like a permanent panel. So
ultimately, yes.
Yeah.
But I used to say,
yeah.
in the meantime, can you get an occupancy permit, even though you have a temporary panel, just in order to get people into housing?
And Tim, remember, a smart panel can be a permanent panel.
Oh, so okay.
It just it flips. So, like, say for example, you need two 220 outlets. You put your electric dryer on one, and then you put an EV charger on the same one, right? Because the likelihood that you're going to run the dryer and charge your EV at the same time is really low. And the smart panel allows those two devices to share the same breaker. It just flips them back and forth.
And do you know if that's in the next code cycle?
I don't believe the code specifies. Like the code doesn't care what size panel you have. It just cares, the end uses, right? Like.
Yeah, I mean, we would calculate the capacity of the panel based on, the loads and the square footages and the uses, based on the electrical code, and that kind of gives us the ampacity. So good questions, Paul. Thank you for the input. I think we have a couple more to get to, if they're still here.
So
by
we
the way,
have,
I understand one thing you did not address, and that is heating swimming pools using hydraulic rather than hydraulic solar panels rather than electric solar panels to heat a swimming pool. I would in the code I would strongly recommend a hydraulic as we do in the city plunge.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So in terms of the state, so the state does allow and gives a credit for what we call solar thermal. It's like solar water heating. It wouldn't necessarily be something regulated at the local level. But yes, it is part of the statewide code, and it is kind of more common with a swimming pool application. So yes, it is definitely prevalent. It's the electric has kind of taken off more from an industry-wide perspective, but that is still, a regulated source and is in the energy code, the statewide California energy code.
Thank you.
okay, we have another, Kendall actually accidentally lowered her hand, so she had her hand up earlier. I'll unmute you now. Go ahead, Kendall.
I was just wondering about the exceptions. So it looks like in terms of that, you had listed as potential exceptions diesel backup generators, and understanding that those are one of those many resources that support electrification. I was also wondering if there had been any consideration for fuel cells as well, since they do generate electricity on site and are certainly a tool that can be utilized to support building electrification. And if not, I'd be happy to, I know that this meeting was scheduled to end about a couple minutes ago, so I'm happy to set up some time offline to discuss as well. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, I can take that one. So in terms of backup power, so the proposed regulations, the way that they're developed for local regulation, it wouldn't necessarily regulate backup power. Although from the market has really taken off in terms of using fuel cells in more like commercial applications. Diesel generators are kind of a reality, unfortunately. But your comment is very relevant in the fact that fuel cells we're seeing a bigger uptick for permit applications related to fuel cells for particular end uses. So yes, your comment's very relevant.
Okay, I don't have any more hands raised. Any questions in the chat?
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we've kind of finished our last question answer session. So we'll move to the next step slide, and then we'll adjourn for the day. Leila, can we tee up the slides?
Yes. Are you seeing the next step slide now on your end?
Yeah.
All right, great. So thank you everyone so much for your comments and questions during today's engagement session. So as kind of next steps looking forward, the city is going to continue on its development efforts for the ordinance, the REACH code ordinance. This will take into consideration the community and industry feedback that has been shared throughout these engagement meetings, and will also take into consideration the statewide cost effectiveness studies that we did touch on in this presentation today. As I also kind of mentioned earlier, that the state REACH code team is working on finalizing all of the cost effectiveness studies that we went over, and we'll be watching closely for the publication and release of those. And then as a next step, after the development process and the draft ordinance is developed, developed that will ultimately be brought to City Council. And the plan for this particular effort is geared at November of this year. After the City Council sessions happen, the state approvals that we touched on earlier in this presentation will then commence, leading up to the local enforcement, which is anticipated to be rolled out with the start of next year. So that is just on a high level some of the next steps. We appreciate your time and energy being here with us today, and again, thank you for all of the great comments and questions that have been discussed. And again, all of that will be taken into consideration as the city starts to keep moving forward with this REACH code development process.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great night.